Come with me on this beginning of a journey of the War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, written in 1898, a classic science fiction story. Chapter 1. The Eve of the War. No one would have believed in the years of the 19th century that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's and yet as mortal as his own, that as man busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the creatures that swam and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over matter. It is possible that under the microscope they do the same. No one gave a thought to the older worlds of space as a source of human danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as impossible or improbable. It is curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days. At most, terrestrial men fancied there might be other men upon Mars, perhaps inferior to themselves, and ready to welcome a missionary enterprise. Yet across the gulf of space, minds that are to our mind as ours are to those of the beast that perish, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. And nearly in the 20th century came the great disillusionment. The planet of Mars, I scarcely need remind the reader, revolves around the sun at the mean distance of 140 million miles, and the light and heat it receives from the sun is barely half of that received by this world. It must be, if the nebular hypothesis has any truth, older than our world, and long before this earth ceased to be molten, life upon its surface must have begun its course. The fact that it is scarcely 1/7 of the volume of Earth must have accelerated its cooling to the temperature at which life could begin. It has air and water, and all this is necessary for the support of animated existence. Yet so vain is man, and so blinded by his vanity, that no writer upon this very end of the 19th century expressed any idea that intellect, life, might have deployed there, far, or indeed at all, beyond its earthly level. Nor was it generally understood that since Mars is older than our Earth, with scarcely a quarter of the superficial area, and remoter from the sun, it necessarily follows that it is not only more distant from life's beginnings, but nearer its end. The secular cooling that must some day overtake our planet has already begun, far indeed, with our neighbor. Its physical condition is still largely a mystery, but we know not that even in its equatorial region, the midday temperature barely approaches that of our coldest winter. Its air is much more attenuated than ours, its oceans have shrunk until they cover but a third of its surface, and its slow seasons change. Huge snowscapes gather and melt about either pole and periodically inundate its temperate zones. That last stage of exhaustion, which to us is still incredibly remote, has become a present day problem for the inhabitants of Mars. The immediate pressure of necessity has brightened their intellects, enlarged their powers, and hardened their hearts. And looking across space with instruments and intelligence such as we have scarcely dreamed of, they see at its nearest distance only 35 million of miles sunward of them a morning star of hope, our own warmer planet, green with vegetation and gray with water, with a cloudy atmosphere eloquent of fertility, with glimpse through its drifting cloud, wisp of broad stretches of populous country and narrow, navy crowded seas. And we men, the creatures who inhabit this earth, must be to them at least as alien, as lowly as are the monkeys and lemurs to us. The intellectual side of man already admits that life is a struggle for existence, and it would seem that this is the belief of the minds upon Mars. Their world is far gone in its cooling, and this world is still crowded with life, but crowded only with what they regard as inferior animals, to carry warfare sunward. Indeed, their only escape from the destruction that generation after generation creeps upon them. And before we judge of them too harshly, we must remember what ruthless and utter destruction our own species has wrought, not only upon animals such as the vanished bison and the dodo, but upon its inferior races, the Tasmanians, in spite of their human likeness, were entirely swept out of existence in a war of extermination waged by European immigrants in the space of 50 years. Are we such apostles of mercy as to complain if the Martians warred in the same spirit? The Martians seem to have calculated their descent with amazing subtlety. Their mathematical learning is evidently far in excess of ours, and to have carried out their preparation with a high, well nigh perfect anonymity. Had our instruments permitted it, we might have seen the gathering trouble far back in the 19th century. Mars has been the star of war, but failed to interpret the fluctuating appearance of the markings they map so well. All this time, the Martians must have been getting ready. During the opposition of 1894, a great light was seen on the illuminated part of the disk, first at the Lick Observatory by the Pernont of Nice, and then by other observers. English readers heard of the first in the issue of the Nature dated August 2nd. I am inclined to think that this blaze must have been the casting of the huge gun. The vast pits sunk into their planet, from which their shots were fired at us. Peculiar markings, as yet unexplained, were seen near the site of that outbreak during the next two oppositions. The storm burst upon us 6 years ago now, as Mars approached opposition. Lavelle of Java sent the wires of the astronomical exchange palpitating with these amazing intelligence of a huge outbreak of incandescent gas upon the planet. It had occurred towards midnight of the 12th, and the spectroscope to which he had at once resorted indicated a mass of flaming gas, chiefly hydrogen, moving with an enormous velocity toward this earth. This jet of fire had become invisible about a quarter past 12. He compared it to the colossal puff of flame suddenly and violently squirted out of the planet, as flaming gases rushed out of a gun. A singularly appropriate phrase it proved. Yet the next day there was nothing of this in the papers, except a little note in the Daily Telegraph, and the world went in ignorance of the gravest dangers that ever threatened the human race. I might not have heard of the eruption at all had I not met Ogilvy, the well-known astronomer at Oldershaw. He was immensely excited at the news, and in excess of his feelings invited me to take a turn with him that night in the scrutiny of the red planet. In spite of all that had happened since, I still remember the vigil very distinctly. The black and silent observatory, that shadowed lantern throwing a feeble glow upon the floor in the corner, the steady ticking of the clockwork of the telescope, the little slit in the roof, an oblong profundity with the stardust streaked across it. Ogilvy moved about, invisible but audible. Looking through the telescope, only saw a circle of deep blue and a little round planet swimming in the field. It seemed such a little thing, so bright and so small, and still, faintly marked with the traverses stripes, and slightly flattened from the perfect round. But so little it was, so silvery warm, a pin's head of light. It was as if it quivered, but really this was the telescope's vibrating with the activity of the clockwork that kept the planet in view. As I watched, the planet seemed to grow larger and smaller, and to advance and recede. But this was simply that my eye was tired. 40 millions of miles it was from us, more than 40 millions of miles of void. Few people realize the immensity of vacancy in which the dust of the material universe swims. Near in the field, I remember, were three faint points of light, three telescopic stars, infinitely remote and all around. It was the unfathomable darkness of empty space. You know how the blackness looks on a frosty starlit night. In a telescope, it seems far profounder and invisible to me because it was so remote and small, flying swiftly and steadily towards me across the incredible distance, drawing nearer every minute. But so many thousands of miles came the thing they were sending us, the thing that was to bring so much struggle and calamity and death to the earth. I never dreamed of it then as I watched. No one on earth dreamed of that unerring missile. That night, too, there was another jutting out of gas from the distant planet. I saw it, a reddish flash at the edge of the slightest projection of the outline, just as the chronometer struck midnight. And at that I told Ogilvy he took my place. That night was warm and I was thirsty, and I went stretching my legs clumsily and feeling my way in the darkness to the little table where the siphon stood, while Ogilvy exclaimed at the streamer of gas that came out towards us. That night another invisible missile started on its way to the earth from Mars, just a second or so under 24 hours after the first. I remember how I sat on the table there in the blackness, with patches of green and crimson swimming before my eyes. I wish I had a light to smoke by, little suspecting the meaning of the minute gleam I had seen, and all that it would presently bring me. Ogilvy watched till one and then gave it up, and we lit the lantern and walked over to his house. Down below in the darkness were Outershaw and Chestersea, and all the hundreds of people sleeping in peace. He was full of speculation that night about the condition of Mars, and scoffed at the vulgar idea of its having inhabitants who were signaling us. His idea was that meteorites might be falling in a heavy shower upon the planet, or that a huge volcano explosion was in progress. He pointed out to me how unlikely it was that an organic evolution had taken the same direction in the two adjacent planets. The chances against anything manlike on Mars are a million to one, he said. Hundreds of observers saw the flame that night, and the night after, about midnight, and again the night after, and so for 10 nights, a flame each night. Why the shot ceased after the 10th, no one on earth has attempted to explain. It might be the gases of the firing cause the Martians inconvenience. Dense cloud of smoke or dust, visible through a powerful telescope on Earth, as little gray fluctuating patches spread through the clearness of the planet's atmosphere and obscured its more familiar features. Even the daily papers woke up to the disturbance at last, and popular notes appeared here and there and everywhere concerning the volcanoes upon Mars. The periodical Punch, I remember, made a happy use of it in the political cartoon, and all unsuspected those missiles the Martians had fired at us earthward, rushing now at the pace at many miles a second through the empty gulf of space, hour by hour and day by day, nearer and nearer. It seems to me now almost incredibly wonderful that with the swift fate hanging over us, men could go about their petty concerns as they did. I remember how jubilant Markham was at securing a new photograph of the planet for the illustrated paper he had edited in those days. People in the later times scarcely realized the abundance and enterprise of our 19th century papers. For my own part, I was much occupied in learning to ride the bicycle and busy upon a series of papers discussing the probable development of moral ideas as civilization progressed. One night, the first missile then could scarcely have been 10 million miles away. I went for a walk with my wife. It was starlight, and I exclaimed the signs of the zodiac to her, and pointed out Mars, a bright dot of light, creeping zenithward toward which so many telescopes were pointed. It was a warm night. Coming home, a party of excursionists from Chestersea or Isleworth passed us, singing and playing music. There were lights in the upper windows of the house as people went to bed. From the railway station in the distance came a sound of shunting trains ringing and rumbling, softened almost into a melody by the distance. My wife pointed out to me that the brightness of red, green, and yellow signal lights hanging in the framework against the sky, it seemed so safe and tranquil. Chapter 2. The Falling Star. Then came the night of the first falling star. It was seen early in the morning rushing over Winchester eastward, a line of flame high in the atmosphere. Hundreds must have seen it and taken it for an ordinary falling star. Albin described it as leaving a greenish streak behind it that glowed for some seconds. Denning, our greatest authority on meteorites, stated that the height of its first appearance was about 90 or 100 miles. It seemed to him that it fell to earth about 100 miles east of him. I was at home at that hour and writing in my study, and although my French window faced towards Outershaw and the blind was up, for I loved in those days to look upon the night sky, I saw nothing of it. Yet this strangest of all things that ever came to earth from outer space must have fallen while I was sitting there, visible to me had I only looked up as it passed. Some of those who saw its flight say it traveled with a hissing sound. I myself heard nothing of that. Many people in Berkshire, Shirley, and Middlesex must have seen the fall of it, and at most have thought that another meteorite had descended. No one seems to have troubled to look for the fallen mass that night. But very early in the morning, poor Ogilvy, who had seen the shooting star and was persuaded that a meteorite lay somewhere on the common between Horshall, Oldershaw, and Woking, rose early with the idea of finding it. Find it he did soon after dawn, and not far from the sand pits. An enormous hole had been made by the impact of the projectile, and the sand and gravel had been flung violently in every direction over the heath, forming heaps visible a mile and a half away. The heather was on fire eastward, and a thin blue smoke rose against the dawn. The thing itself lay almost entirely buried in sand amidst the scattered splinters of a fir tree. It had shivered to fragments in its descent. The uncovered part had appeared of a huge cylinder caked over in its outline, softened by a thick, scaly, dun-colored incrustation. It had a diameter of about 30 yards. He approached the mass, surprised at the size and more so the shape, since most meteorites are rounded more or less completely. It was, however, still so hot from its flight through the air as to forbid his near approach. A stirring noise within its cylinder he ascribed to the unequal cooling of its surface, for at the time it had not occurred to him that it might be hollow. He remained standing at the edge of the pit that the thing had made for itself, staring at its strange appearance, astonished chiefly at its unusual shape and color, and dimly perceiving even that some evidence of design in its arrival. The early morning was wonderfully still, and the sun, just clearing the pine trees toward Weybridge, was already warm. He did not remember hearing any birds that morning. There were certainly no breeze stirring, and the only sounds were the faint movements from within the cindery cylinder. He was all alone on the common. Then suddenly he noticed with a start that some of the gray clinker, the ashy incrustation that covered the meteorite, was falling off the circular edge of the end. It was dropping off in flakes and raining down upon the sand. A large piece suddenly came off and flew with a sharp noise that brought his heart into his mouth. For a minute he scarcely realized what this meant, and although the heat was excessive, he clambered down into the pit, close to the bulk, to see the thing more clearly. He fancied even that the cooling of the body might account for this. But what disturbed that idea was the fact that the ash was falling only from one end of the cylinder. And then he perceived that was very slowly the circular top of the cylinder was rotating on its body. It was such a gradual movement that he discovered it only through noticing that a black mark that had been near him 5 minutes ago was now on the other side of the circumference. Even then, he scarcely understood what this indicated, until he heard a muffled grating sound and saw the black mark jerk forward an inch or so. Then the thing came upon him in a flash. The cylinder was artificial, hollow, with an end that screwed out. Something within the cylinder was unscrewing the top. "Good heavens!" said Ogilvy. "There's a man in it! Men in it! Half roasted to death, trying to escape!" At once, with a quick mental leap, he linked the thing with the flash on Mars. The thought of the confined creature was so dreadful to him that he forgot the heat, and went forward to the cylinder to help turn. But luckily the dull radiation arrested him before he could burn his hands on the still glowing metal. At that he stood irresolute for a moment, and then turned, scrambled out of the pit, and set off, running wildly into Woking. The time then must have been somewhere about 6 o'clock. He met a wagoner and tried to make him understand, but the tale he told and his appearance were so wild, his hat had fallen off into the pit, that the man simply drove on. He was equally unsuccessful with the potman who was just unlocking the doors of his public house by the Horsham Bridge. The fellow thought he was a lunatic at large, and made an unsuccessful attempt to shut him into the tap room. That sobered him a little, and when he saw Henson, the London journalist, in the garden, he called over the palings and made himself understood. "Henderson," he called, "you saw that shooting star last night." "Well," said Henderson, "it's out on Horsham Common now." "Good Lord," said Henderson. "Fallen meteorite? That's good." "But it's something more than a meteorite. It's a cylinder, an artificial cylinder, man, and there's something inside." Henderson stood up with his spade in his hand. "What's that?" he said. He was deaf in one ear. Ogilvy told him all that he had seen. Henderson was a minute or so taking it in. Then he dropped his spade, snatched up his jacket, and came out into the road. The two men hurried back at once to the common, and found the cylinder still lying in the same position. But now the sounds inside had ceased, and a thin circle of bright metal showed between the top and the body of the cylinder. Air was either entering or escaping at the rim with a thin, sizzling sound. They listened, rapped on the scaly burnt metal with a stick, and meeting with no response, they both concluded that man or men inside must be insensible or dead. Of course, the two were quite unable to do anything. They shouted consolation and promises, and went off back to the town again to get help. One can imagine them, covered with sand, excited and disordered, running up the little street in the bright sunlight, just as the shop folks were taking down their shutters and people were opening their bedroom windows. Henderson went into the railway station at once in order to telegraph the news to London. The newspaper articles had prepared men's mind for the reception of the idea. By 8 o'clock a number of boys and unemployed men had already started for the common to see the dead men from Mars. That was the form the story took. I heard of it first from my newspaper boy about 9:15 when I went to get my daily chronicle. I was naturally startled, and lost no time in going out and across the Ottershaw Bridge to the sand pits. To be continued.